He was called Daniel by the people who sometimes noticed him near the old subway entrance on Fifth Avenue. He was 9 years old and had learned early how to stay quiet in loud places. His mother worked 2 cleaning jobs and came home late every night with tired hands and kind eyes. His father had died when Daniel was very young, and no one talked about it much because it hurt too deeply. Music was the only thing that made the world feel softer to Daniel. He had no piano at home and no lessons and no one who taught him notes or technique. What he had was memory and patience and ears that listened more closely than most people ever did. Every afternoon after school, he walked past the same plaza where a grand piano sat under a simple shelter. The piano belonged to a program that allowed musicians to play in public spaces. Most days, adults in clean coats played short pieces while crowds passed by without stopping. Daniel never touched the piano. He only stood nearby pretending to wait for someone while listening carefully. He memorized sounds the way other children memorized football scores or video game levels. At night, he tapped melodies on the small wooden table in their apartment while his mother cooked rice and beans. She never told him to stop because she could see peace on his face when he played. One winter afternoon, the city felt sharper and colder than usual. Wind moved between the tall buildings and carried the sound of traffic and voices. That was the day the men arrived. They were 4 wealthy businessmen walking together after a meeting. Their suits were expensive and their shoes shined. They talked loudly and laughed often because the day had gone well for them. One of them owned several companies and was known in the financial world for his confidence and sharp decisions. People listened when he spoke and moved when he entered a room. As they passed the plaza, the sound of the piano drifted through the air. The man playing was an amateur and struggled with the melody. One of the businessmen stopped and smiled in amusement. He watched for a moment, then laughed lightly. He made a comment about how easy the piece was and how anyone could play it. His friends laughed with him. Their laughter was not cruel, but careless in the way only comfortable people can be. Daniel stood nearby holding a small paper bag with his lunch leftovers inside. He had not planned to speak to anyone that day. He rarely spoke to strangers, but something in him shifted when he heard the man laugh. It was not anger. It was a quiet certainty. He knew the melody being played and he knew how it should sound. Without fully thinking, he stepped forward. The businessman noticed him and looked down surprised. Daniel was small for his age and wore worn sneakers and a thin jacket. The man smiled again and asked if the boy liked music. Daniel nodded and said softly that he could play that song. The group laughed again, thinking it was a joke. One of the men asked where his piano teacher was. Daniel said he did not have one. Another man said children always imagined big things. The wealthy man at the center chuckled and waved his hand as if amused by the innocence of youth. Daniel felt his face warm, but he did not step back. He repeated calmly that he could play it. The man looked at him closely now and saw that the boy was serious. There was something steady in his eyes. Out of curiosity more than belief, the businessman stepped aside and told the pianist to let the boy try. A small crowd began to form because people sensed something unusual was happening. Daniel climbed onto the bench. His feet did not reach the ground. His hands hovered above the keys for a moment, not out of fear, but out of respect. He took a breath and began to play. What came out of the piano did not sound like a child guessing at notes. It sounded intentional and full. The melody flowed clean and strong, and each chord landed exactly where it should. People stopped walking. Conversations faded. Even the traffic seemed to quiet. Daniel played the piece better than the man before him, and then he continued into another melody that no one expected. The businessmen stopped smiling. The wealthy man felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. This was not talent that could be dismissed as luck. This was understanding. Daniel played with emotion that came from somewhere deep and real. When he finished, he lowered his hands slowly and looked up, not proudly but honestly. The plaza was silent before applause broke out. Daniel did not bow. He simply stood and stepped away. He had done what he knew he could do. He picked up his paper bag and moved back toward the sidewalk. The businessman called out and asked his name. Daniel answered quietly and kept walking. That moment marked the beginning of a story none of them yet understood. The applause followed Daniel as he moved away from the piano, but he did not turn back because he did not know how to receive it. and did not feel it belonged to him, yet he walked until the sound faded into the noise of the street and his heartbeat slowed again. He felt light inside, not proud, and not scared, just calm, as if he had spoken a truth that needed to be spoken. The businessmen stood still longer than they expected. The wealthy man who had laughed earlier felt unsettled. He had seen talent before in boardrooms and at private events. But this was different. This was raw and untouched. And honest. He realized that his laughter had not been harmless curiosity, but a habit of assuming. He understood the limits of people he had never met. That thought stayed with him as the crowd slowly disappeared. One of the men suggested they continue walking, but the wealthy man could not move yet. He asked one of his assistants to follow the boy quietly and learn where he was from, not out of suspicion, but out of genuine need to understand what kind of life produced a child like that, with no training and no fear of a grand piano on a city street. Daniel walked home with longer steps than usual. The city felt less heavy to him. He replayed the sounds in his head, not to admire himself, but to remember them. His mother noticed his energy. When he came through the door, she asked if something good had happened. He told her. He played a piano outside, and people listened. She smiled and hugged him, and told him she was not surprised. She had always believed that music lived in him, even if the world had not noticed yet. That night, the wealthy man could not sleep. He kept hearing the boy's playing in his mind. He thought of his own childhood, filled with lessons and expectations and pressure. He had been good at many things, but never free in them. He wondered what it would feel like to be that honest at such a young age. By morning, he made a decision that felt risky, not financially, but personally. The next day, he returned to the plaza earlier than planned. The piano was there again, and a few people gathered around it. Daniel was not there. The man waited longer than he ever waited for anyone. He asked around quietly and learned that the boy usually came after school. He adjusted his schedule without complaint. When Daniel arrived, he froze. When he saw the man waiting, the wealthy man smiled. But this time it was careful and respectful. He asked if Daniel would sit with him for a moment. They sat on a nearby bench and spoke like two people without titles. Daniel told him about his mother and their small apartment, and the nights he listened to music through open windows. The man listened without interrupting. He asked Daniel if he had ever thought about lessons. Daniel said he had, but did not believe it was possible. The man said, sometimes doors open when we least expect them, and that help does not always come with conditions. Daniel looked at him, searching for the joke, but found none. They agreed to meet again and talk more. Daniel went home unsure but curious. His mother listened carefully. When he explained, she was cautious, but saw sincerity in the man's actions. She agreed to meet him as well, because she wanted to protect her son without limiting his future. Over the next weeks, the man arranged simple things, first a proper piano to practice on in a community center nearby, then meetings with a teacher who understood how to guide without forcing. Daniel struggled at first, not with learning, but with being observed. He was used to listening alone, and now people watched him closely. The teacher noticed this and adjusted, allowing Daniel to play freely before correcting anything. The wealthy man visited often, but stayed quiet. He wanted to support without shaping Daniel into something he was not. He learned more in those weeks than he had in years. He learned patience, humility, and the value of listening before speaking. Daniel changed slowly. His playing grew deeper and more confident, but his character remained gentle. He still helped his mother and still walked the same streets. The piano no longer felt like a distant dream, but a living part of his days. The city moved on, unaware that something rare was unfolding quietly, yet the moment that began with a chuckle had shifted many lives already. And the true weight of that shift was only beginning to show. Daniel's days began to settle into a new rhythm that felt unfamiliar but not frightening. Each morning, he went to school carrying the same worn backpack. Yet something inside him had shifted. Teachers noticed that he seemed more focused and calmer, as if he carried a quiet confidence that did not need to be shown. His classmates did not know what had happened in the plaza, and Daniel did not tell them. He was not hiding it, but he did not know how to explain it either. After school, he walked to the community center, where the piano waited for him. The first time he entered the room alone, he stood still for a long moment. He touched the keys gently, as if greeting an old friend who had suddenly moved closer. The sound filled the small space and echoed back to him, stronger and clearer than anything he had known before. He played slowly at first, letting the room teach him how sound lived inside walls. His teacher was a woman named Claire who had spent her life around music and talented children. She had seen prodigies burn out, and late bloomers rise quietly. She understood that Daniel was different because his relationship with music was not built on praise or ambition, it was built on listening. Claire never rushed him. She asked questions instead of giving orders. She let him explore pieces fully before offering guidance. Daniel trusted her quickly, because she treated him like a person, not a project. The wealthy man, whose name was Richard, watched all of this unfold from a careful distance. He funded the lessons and the space, but rarely interfered. He came to understand that his role was not to direct, but to protect the conditions that allowed growth. Richard faced quiet resistance from people in his world who did not understand why he invested time and resources into one child. They suggested competitions, branding, media exposure. Richard listened and declined. He remembered the sound of that first performance and did not want it buried under noise. At home, Daniel's mother Maria felt both gratitude and fear. She worried about promises that might disappear, and about a world that could hurt her son if expectations grew too heavy. She attended every meeting and asked hard questions. Richard answered them honestly. He told her he could not predict the future, but he could promise respect and transparency that mattered to her more than guarantees. Weeks turned into months and Daniel's playing changed. He began to understand structure and technique, but more importantly, he learned how to communicate emotion intentionally. He discovered that silence between notes mattered as much as sound. Claire helped him name feelings through music: sadness, hope, frustration, calm. Daniel realized he had been doing this instinctively his whole life, and now he had words for it. One evening, Richard invited a small group of musicians to listen, not for judgment, but for shared experience. Daniel hesitated, but agreed. The room was quiet and simple, no cameras, no announcements. When Daniel played, the air felt heavy in a good way. Listeners closed their eyes, some wiped tears without understanding why. When he finished, no one spoke for several seconds, because language felt insufficient. Afterward, a cellist approached Daniel and thanked him for reminding her why she began playing as a child. Another man said he felt younger just listening. Daniel accepted these words politely, but did not absorb them deeply. He was learning that praise could be warm, but also distracting. Claire helped him stay grounded, reminding him that music was a conversation, not a performance. At school, rumors eventually reached Daniel. Children talked about a boy who played piano downtown. Teachers mentioned articles they had heard about, though none had been written. Daniel felt exposed and uncomfortable. He withdrew slightly, until Maria and Claire helped him talk through it. They explained that being seen did not mean being owned. He could choose when to share and when to stay quiet. Richard faced his own challenges. His colleagues questioned his priorities and hinted that his focus had softened him. He realized they were right and felt no shame. He began spending less time in boardrooms and more time listening. He reconnected with parts of himself he had buried long ago under ambition. He understood now that success without meaning felt hollow. The city continued its pace, unaware that something delicate was being shaped within it. Daniel's hands grew stronger and more precise, but his heart stayed open. He still played in the plaza, sometimes not to prove anything, but to remember where it began. People stopped and listened, but Daniel no longer searched faces for reaction. He played because it felt honest. One afternoon, a woman recognized him from the first day and thanked him for changing her understanding of talent. She said she stopped laughing at people she did not know after that day. Daniel listened quietly and nodded. He did not realize yet how far the ripple of that moment would travel, but it was already moving through lives in ways none of them could fully see. As spring approached, Daniel found himself standing at a crossroads. He had never imagined the music that once lived quietly inside him was now reaching outward, touching people he did not know, and places he had never seen. Invitations began arriving, not loudly, but steadily. A small art school asked if he would consider attending weekend sessions. A local orchestra director requested a private meeting. Claire and Maria read every message, together weighing each word carefully. Daniel felt confused more than excited. He loved playing, but the idea of being shaped into something specific made him uneasy. He worried that if music became an obligation, it might lose the honesty that made it feel safe. Claire noticed his hesitation and spoke gently. She told him that growth did not require surrender, and that learning how to say no was as important as learning how to play well. Daniel held onto those words. Richard watched the situation closely. He remembered his own youth, when choices had been made for him in the name of opportunity. He promised himself he would not let that happen again. He helped Maria arrange meetings where Daniel could speak for himself. No decisions were rushed, no expectations were placed beyond honesty and curiosity. This approach confused some professionals, but it protected what mattered most. One afternoon, Daniel visited a private music academy. The building was quiet and polished and filled with portraits of past students who had gone on to fame. The director spoke kindly, but focused heavily on outcomes and achievements. Daniel listened respectfully, but felt a tightness in his chest. When asked how he felt, Daniel said he liked learning, but did not want music to feel like a race. The room grew still. The director smiled politely, but did not respond to that feeling. Later, Daniel told Claire that the academy felt like a museum of pressure. She nodded, and said some places preserve success, while others nurture growth. She reminded him that talent needed space, not walls. Daniel felt relief knowing he did not have to choose just because something looked impressive. At the same time, life at home remained grounded. Maria continued working long hours, and Daniel continued helping where he could. Their routines stayed simple: meals, shared quietly, evenings, filled with practice and conversation. This balance kept Daniel anchored. He understood that music was not an escape from his life, but a part of it. Richard faced growing attention from media circles who had begun to hear fragments of the story. A child prodigy discovered on the street made for compelling headlines. He declined interviews repeatedly and insisted that Daniel remain unnamed and unexposed. This decision frustrated journalists, but protected Daniel from becoming a symbol instead of a person. Richard accepted the criticism calmly. He had learned that some things lost value when explained too loudly. One evening, Daniel returned to the plaza alone. The piano was there, and the city moved around it. As always, he sat down without announcement and began to play not a complex piece, but a simple melody he had written himself. Passers-by slowed, some listened briefly, others stayed longer. A few recorded on their phones. Daniel did not notice he was thinking about the first day and how different he felt now. A man approached quietly and listened from a distance. He was older and walked with care. When Daniel finished, the man thanked him and said he used to play before life pulled him elsewhere. He said listening made him feel whole again. Daniel smiled and said music had a way of reminding people who they were. The man nodded and walked away, wiping his eyes. That night, Daniel wrote his first full composition with Claire's guidance. It was not perfect, and it was not meant to be. It carried pieces of his life, his mother's quiet strength, the city's constant movement, the weight of being seen, and the comfort of being understood. Claire told him this was the beginning of learning how to speak in his own voice through sound. Daniel slept deeply afterward. Pressure continued to grow around them, but the foundation remained strong. Maria trusted the people around her son, and Daniel trusted himself more each day. He learned that saying yes was powerful only when paired with intention. He learned that not all doors needed to be opened at once, some could wait without disappearing. Richard observed all of this with humility. He realized that supporting Daniel had changed him more than any success he had known. He spent more time listening and less time speaking. He began mentoring young professionals differently, focusing on awareness rather than dominance. He understood now that influence carried responsibility, and that laughter at the wrong moment could echo longer than expected. The story that began with a chuckle was no longer about surprise. It was about choice, protection, and patience. Daniel had not become famous, and he had not been defined by achievement. He had become something rarer, a child allowed to grow at his own pace, guided by respect and understanding. The world continued to watch quietly, unaware that the most important work was happening far from the spotlight. Daniel turned 11 during a quiet summer that felt longer than any before it. The heat lingered in the city, and people moved slower, as if time itself had softened. Daniel spent more hours at the community center than anywhere else, not because he was told to, but because it felt like the safest place to think. Music had become a language he could use when words felt too heavy, and the piano listened without judgment. Claire noticed that Daniel was beginning to ask deeper questions, not about technique, but about meaning. He asked why certain melodies made people cry, and why others made them feel brave. He wondered whether music came from the hands or from somewhere deeper. Claire answered honestly. She told him that music came from attention, from how closely someone listened to the world and to themselves. Daniel carried that idea with him and began paying attention to everything: the sound of trains, the rhythm of footsteps, the way his mother breathed when she slept after long shifts. Maria saw changes too. Daniel was still gentle, But he was no longer unsure of his place. He spoke with more clarity and looked people in the eye. He helped more at home without being asked, and began writing short notes to his mother when she worked late, telling her what he practiced and what he cooked for himself. These small acts showed a growing sense of responsibility that both comforted and worried her. Opportunities continued to appear. Some were respectful and patient, others were eager and loud. One foundation offered funding in exchange for exclusive rights to Daniel's story. Richard declined immediately without consulting anyone, because he knew the answer already. He explained later that no amount of money justified turning a child into a product. Maria thanked him quietly, and Daniel felt a deep sense of trust strengthen inside him. Richard faced backlash for his refusals. Some investors questioned his judgment and hinted that he was missing a rare chance. He listened, but did not bend. He had learned that not every opportunity was a gift. Some were tests of values. He felt steadier now than he had in decades, and accepted the consequences with calm resolve. Daniel began performing more often in small, controlled settings, never advertised, never recorded without permission. These gatherings were intentional. People sat close and listened fully. After each performance, Daniel spoke briefly about what the music meant to him. He did not rehearse these words. They came naturally and honestly, and people responded with respect rather than applause. One evening, a woman approached Maria after a performance and said her son wanted to quit music because it felt like pressure. She said watching Daniel had reminded him why he started. Maria listened and felt pride mixed with humility. She realized that her son was not just changing his own path, but touching others quietly without trying. As autumn arrived, Daniel started middle school and faced a new environment with louder voices and stronger opinions. Some students recognized him and asked questions. Others teased him, calling him piano boy. Daniel felt the sting, but did not react. He spoke to Claire about it, and she told him that being different often invited misunderstanding. And that strength showed in how one responded, not in what others said. Daniel took this advice seriously and chose patience over defense. He also began mentoring younger children at the community center, helping them explore sound without rules. Watching them reminded him of himself before attention entered his life. He protected their freedom fiercely and refused to correct them unless asked. Claire watched this unfold and knew he was learning leadership without realizing it. One day, Richard invited Daniel and Maria to his home. It was large and quiet and filled with art from many cultures. Daniel felt small at first, but Richard spoke to him as always without distance. He showed Daniel a room with an old piano that had belonged to his mother. He admitted he had not touched it in years and asked Daniel if he would play. Daniel hesitated, then sat and played a simple piece. Richard closed his eyes and listened. When the music ended, Richard thanked him and said he felt closer to his mother than he had in a long time. That moment shifted something again. Daniel understood that music could heal in ways that words could not, and that responsibility came with that power. He spoke with Claire afterward about fear of disappointing people. Claire told him that the goal was never to carry others, but to walk alongside them. Music was a bridge, not a burden. Daniel held onto that image. As winter approached, Daniel wrote more music. His compositions grew more complex and reflective. He explored themes of absence, hope, and belonging. Claire guided him gently, helping him refine without erasing his voice. Daniel began to see himself not just as a player, but as a creator, someone who could shape feeling into form. This realization brought both excitement and humility. Maria worried quietly about the future. She feared losing the simple life they had built, yet she saw her son growing in wisdom and steadiness. She realized that protecting him did not mean holding him back. It meant staying present and honest. She trusted that foundation more than any plan. Richard began stepping back further, allowing Daniel and Claire to guide decisions. He remained available, but no longer central. He felt content knowing that his role had evolved from catalyst to supporter. He found peace in that shift and applied the same approach to other areas of his life, listening more, guiding less. The city changed with the seasons, and Daniel changed with it. He learned that growth was not always loud. Sometimes it happened quietly in practice rooms late at night, or in conversations that never reached the public eye. The story that had once drawn attention was now rooted in something deeper: patience, intention, and care. By the end of that year, Daniel stood on the edge of adolescence, grounded not by fame or expectation, but by understanding. He knew that his journey would not be simple, but he trusted the people around him, And the voice within him, the laughter that had once sparked everything, had faded into memory, replaced by something far more lasting, a sense of purpose, shaped gently and honestly over time. Daniel entered his teenage years with a quiet awareness that life was widening around him. The city felt larger and smaller at the same time, larger, because new paths kept appearing, and smaller, because he now understood how connected everything was. Music no longer felt like something that happened to him, it felt like something he carried with intention and care. His hands grew stronger, and his reach across the keyboard widened. Claire adjusted his practice, gently helping him understand physical limits and patience. She reminded him often that growth in music mirrored growth in life, and that forcing either only caused harm. Daniel listened closely. He had learned to trust guidance that respected his pace. At school, he became more visible, not because of fame, but because of presence. Teachers noticed his calm, students noticed that he listened before speaking. Some sought him out, quietly asking for help or advice. Daniel did not see himself as someone with answers, but he offered attention, and that seemed enough. He learned that listening could be a form of leadership. The teasing faded as curiosity replaced it. A few classmates attended his small performances and saw something they had not expected. They saw honesty rather than show. Daniel did not change himself to be accepted, and over time that steadiness drew respect. He learned that confidence did not require noise. Maria watched her son growing taller and more thoughtful. She felt moments of fear when she imagined the future pulling him away, yet she also felt pride in how grounded he remained. They talked often at night, sharing meals and stories. Daniel asked more questions about his father, and Maria answered when she could. They spoke about loss not as a wound, but as a part of their shared strength. Music filled those conversations, even when no piano was present. Richard continued to observe from a respectful distance. He had stepped back from daily involvement, but remained a steady presence. He saw Daniel becoming someone who did not need protection from opportunity, because he knew how to choose wisely. Richard reflected on how rare that was, and how different his own youth might have been with similar guidance. He felt gratitude rather than regret. An invitation arrived from a respected cultural foundation, proposing a youth concert series. The offer was thoughtful and limited in scope. No contracts, no media pressure, just a chance to share music with diverse audiences. Daniel considered it carefully. He spoke with Claire and Maria, and Richard. Each shared perspective without pushing. Daniel weighed his feelings and agreed on the condition that the performances remained simple and accessible. The foundation accepted without hesitation. Preparation began slowly. Daniel practiced not just notes, but presence. Claire encouraged him to imagine the audience not as observers, but as participants in a shared moment. Daniel practiced breathing and grounding before playing. These skills helped him stay centered, even when nerves appeared. The first concert took place in a small hall filled with families, elders, and young musicians. Daniel walked onto the stage without announcement and sat quietly. The room settled as he began to play. His music carried stories without explanation. People leaned forward, listening not to judge, but to feel. When he finished, there was applause, but Daniel bowed briefly and left the stage without lingering. He felt complete rather than exhilarated. After the concert, a young boy approached him shyly and said he wanted to play piano too. Daniel knelt to his level and asked what sounds he liked. The boy smiled and talked about rain and trains. Daniel told him those were good places to start. The simplicity of that exchange stayed with Daniel longer than any compliment. As the series continued, Daniel learned how to manage energy. He rested more and practiced less. When needed, he declined events when they felt wrong. He learned that boundaries protected creativity rather than limiting it. Claire praised his awareness and reminded him that sustainability mattered more than momentum. Challenges still arose. One performance drew unexpected attention from online recordings. Daniel felt uneasy seeing comments and interpretations he had not intended. He spoke openly about this with Maria and Claire. They helped him understand that once shared music belonged partly to listeners, and that letting go did not mean losing oneself. This lesson was difficult but necessary. Daniel wrote new pieces during this time, exploring uncertainty, and change. His compositions reflected questions rather than answers. Claire guided him through refining structure without dulling emotion. Daniel began to understand composition as a way of thinking, not just expressing. He felt himself maturing through sound. Richard attended one concert, quietly sitting near the back. He watched Daniel move through the experience with calm authority. He felt pride, but more importantly, respect. He saw that Daniel no longer needed guidance from him, and that this was the true measure of support. Given well, Richard carried that lesson into his work, mentoring others with restraint and trust. At home, life remained steady. Maria adjusted her work schedule, slightly allowing more shared time. She saw Daniel becoming more independent, yet still connected. They cooked together, talked about books, and listened to music beyond piano, exploring jazz, folk, and world sounds. Daniel absorbed everything with curiosity. The city continued its relentless pace, but Daniel moved within it with intention. He still returned to the plaza, occasionally playing for strangers and remembering beginnings. These moments grounded him, reminding him why he started and who he was beneath layers of growth. By the end of that year, Daniel understood that music was not his identity, but his companion. It walked with him through change, offering clarity. When needed, he did not know where his path would lead, but he trusted his ability to listen and choose. The story that began with disbelief had transformed into one of quiet confidence, shaped by care, patience, and respect. And it was still unfolding with honesty at its core. Daniel reached 16 during a season when everything felt close to shifting again. His voice had deepened, his shoulders broadened, and his understanding of the world sharpened. He no longer saw music only as expression, but also as responsibility, not a burden, but a quiet duty to remain honest, even when the world encouraged shortcuts. His days were carefully balanced: school, studies, music time, family time, and solitude. He learned that solitude was not loneliness, but space where thoughts could settle. He spent long hours walking through the city without headphones, listening to life itself. The sound of buses, stopping, distant conversations, footsteps on pavement, all of it fed his inner rhythm. Claire noticed that Daniel was no longer just learning music, but questioning purpose. He asked why some artists lost themselves to praise, and why others disappeared despite talent. Claire spoke truthfully. She said some people listened to the noise around them more than the voice inside. Daniel took that seriously and began journaling thoughts, not for anyone else, but to keep himself anchored. At school, Daniel became someone younger students looked up to. Teachers trusted him with responsibility. He led a small music group focused on collaboration. Rather than performance, he encouraged others to create without fear of being wrong. This approach confused some who expected hierarchy, but it created a space where creativity thrived. Daniel found deep satisfaction in that environment. Maria watched her son growing into a young man with humility and strength. She worried less now, because she saw wisdom guiding his choices. They talked openly about fear, success, and meaning. Maria told Daniel that she trusted him not because he was talented, but because he listened to his conscience. That affirmation stayed with him deeply. Richard invited Daniel to lunch one afternoon. For the first time in months, they spoke as equals about life values and change. Richard admitted that meeting Daniel had altered how he measured success. He had stepped away from several ventures and focused more on mentorship and ethics. Daniel listened respectfully, understanding that growth traveled in both directions. They parted with gratitude, not dependence. An international cultural exchange program reached out, offering Daniel a chance to study abroad for a short time. The opportunity was carefully structured, focused on learning rather than exposure. Daniel considered it seriously. He felt both excitement and hesitation leaving home, even briefly felt heavy. He discussed it with Claire and Maria. They encouraged him to explore while staying rooted. Daniel agreed, knowing growth often required temporary discomfort. Preparation for travel brought reflection. Daniel revisited old recordings, listened to early compositions, and remembered the boy he had been. He felt compassion for that younger self and gratitude for the protection he had received. He promised himself to extend the same patience to others whenever possible. The journey abroad introduced Daniel to musicians from different backgrounds, languages, and traditions. Communication often happened through sound rather than words. Daniel learned humility again, realizing how much he did not know. He listened more than he played, absorbing rhythms unfamiliar to him. This experience expanded his understanding of music as a universal language, shaped by culture and history. One evening during the program, Daniel was invited to share a piece. He chose one inspired by his city and his mother. And the piano in the plaza he played with restraint, allowing space for listeners to enter the story. When he finished, there was quiet before appreciation. Daniel felt connected, not celebrated. That feeling mattered most. Living away from home briefly taught Daniel independence. He managed schedules, emotions, and expectations without familiar support. Yet he remained grounded through routine writing, playing, walking. He learned that roots traveled with him, not tied to location, but to values. Upon returning home, Daniel saw the city differently. Familiar streets felt deeper, layered with memory. He visited the plaza alone late one evening and sat quietly without playing. He listened to silence and movement and felt complete without touching the keys. That moment confirmed something important. Music was part of him, but not all of him. Attention around Daniel grew again as people noticed his maturity. Some suggested professional pathways, recordings, representation. Daniel listened, but did not rush. He understood that timing mattered as much as opportunity. Claire supported his patience, reminding him that readiness included emotional readiness, not just skill. Daniel began mentoring more intentionally, working with children from challenging backgrounds. He recognized pieces of himself in them and offered presence rather than instruction. He encouraged curiosity and listening. Watching them explore sound reminded him of beginnings and reinforced his purpose. One particular student struggled with confidence and often stopped playing mid-phrase. Daniel sat beside him and played quietly until the boy joined again. That simple act unlocked something. The boy smiled and continued. Daniel realized then that music could lead without words, and that guidance sometimes meant walking alongside rather than ahead. Maria attended one of Daniel's local performances and watched from the back. She saw a young man comfortable in himself, sharing space rather than commanding it. Tears came quietly, not from pride alone, but from recognition of how far they had come together. She knew sacrifices had shaped this journey and felt peace in their outcome. As Daniel approached the end of that year, he faced choices about future education and direction. He felt no urgency to define everything. He trusted that clarity would come through listening and experience. He understood that life was not a straight path, but a conversation unfolding over time. The laughter that once underestimated him had transformed into respect. But Daniel no longer defined himself by others' reactions. He defined himself by alignment with his values, honesty, patience, and care. His story had become less about surprise and more about continuity, about staying true through growth and change. Standing at the edge of adulthood, Daniel felt neither fear nor certainty. He felt readiness to listen to what came next. The journey that began with disbelief had shaped a young man grounded in purpose and empathy. The world around him continued to change, but Daniel moved forward with quiet confidence, carrying music, not as a shield or spotlight, but as a companion guiding him toward whatever awaited beyond the next horizon. Daniel stepped into adulthood without ceremony. There was no single moment that announced the change, no applause, no turning point that demanded attention. It arrived quietly through choices he made each day, and through the way he carried himself in the world. Music remained close, but it no longer felt like the center of everything. It felt like a steady presence walking beside him. He chose to study music and social development together, believing that understanding people mattered as much as understanding sound. This decision surprised some, but felt natural to him. He wanted to build spaces where creativity could exist without fear. He wanted children like the one he once was to feel seen without being shaped too quickly. His education became another way of listening. Maria watched him leave home with mixed emotions, pride, gratitude, and a deep sense of release. She had protected him when he was small and trusted him as he grew. Now, she learned to let go while staying connected. Their bond did not weaken with distance. It deepened through honest conversations and shared values. Daniel carried her strength into every new place. Claire remained a guide and friend. Their relationship evolved from teacher and student into mutual respect. She reminded him that learning never ended, and that humility kept creativity alive. Daniel carried her lessons into classrooms, community centers, and conversations. He passed them on without naming their source, allowing wisdom to travel freely. Richard attended Daniel's first public lecture. Quietly sitting among strangers, he listened as Daniel spoke about music as a tool for connection rather than achievement. He spoke calmly, without impressing or persuading, simply sharing what he had learned through experience. Richard felt the same quiet impact he had felt years earlier in the plaza. He realized that true influence echoed softly, but lasted longer. Daniel continued playing piano, But with intention, he performed in hospitals, shelters, schools, and small halls. He adapted his music to the space. And the people never repeating the same approach twice, he turned down lucrative offers that required compromise. He felt no regret. He understood that fulfillment did not require visibility, only alignment. One evening, he returned to the plaza where everything began. The piano was older now, its surface worn by years of hands, and whether he sat and played not to remember, but to honor the moment, he played, simply allowing sound to exist without expectation. Passers-by listened, some recognized him, most did not, and that felt right. A young child stood nearby watching closely. Daniel noticed and smiled. When he finished, the child asked if anyone could learn to play. Daniel answered honestly, saying yes, if they listened patiently. The child nodded, as if that made sense, and walked away. Daniel felt the circle close, gently, without finality. Over time, Daniel helped establish a community program, placing instruments in public spaces paired with mentorship. Not competition, the program grew slowly, rooted in trust. Rather than promotion, it became a place where people of all ages discovered sound without judgment. Daniel stayed involved, but never centered himself. He believed leadership meant creating conditions where others could thrive independently. His life was not free of difficulty. There were moments of doubt, fatigue, and frustration, but he met them with the same listening that had guided him since childhood. He rested when needed, spoke when necessary, and acted with care. His sense of purpose remained flexible, grounded in values rather than outcomes. Maria attended a small gathering where Daniel played one of his later compositions. It carried echoes of his early melodies, but held deeper complexity. When the music ended, she did not clap immediately. She closed her eyes and breathed, feeling the journey within the sound. When she opened them, Daniel was watching her, and they shared a quiet understanding. Years passed, and Daniel became known not as a prodigy, but as a presence, someone who listened deeply and created spaces for others to be heard. His story circulated occasionally, often simplified. He did not correct it. He knew that truth lived in lived moments, not headlines. One afternoon, a journalist asked him about the millionaire who had once laughed. Daniel smiled gently and said laughter had opened a door, and listening had kept it open. He did not speak of blame or credit, only of moments and choices. The journalist paused, sensing the weight behind those words. As evening settled, Daniel walked through the city, listening to its familiar rhythm. He felt no need to rush or prove anything. He carried music within him, shaped by patience and care. The boy who once stepped forward without fear had grown into a man who stepped forward with intention. The story ended not with triumph or applause, but with continuity, a life shaped by listening, choice, and quiet courage. The unthinkable moment had not been the music itself, but what followed: the commitment to remain human in a world that often rushed past understanding. And in that commitment, Daniel found meaning that no laughter could diminish and no silence could erase.